Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Dan Grissom, and in this video tutorial we are going to talk about the FileNotFoundException. Now, as you would expect, the FileNotFoundException is an exception that is generated when a file is not found that we are trying to open. However, there are a few caveats that may trick you if you're not aware of them. So we're essentially going to try to read from a few files and write to a few files and really just show you when to expect the FileNotFoundException to occur, when that it won't occur when you might think it actually would occur, and then finally how to actually handle those exceptions and detect them. Okay, so to start off, I have a very simple program here. Essentially all we're doing right now is we're prompting the user for a file to read from or write to, and then whether they want to read or write. So if you actually run this program, you'll see it'll say please enter the name of the file you wish to read or write. So I might say something like input.txt. And then it'll ask me, would you like to read from the file or write to it? So if I say read, essentially what I want it to do is read that file and print the contents of that file to the screen. If I run this program again, this time I say input.txt and I say write, it'll basically ask me to enter a sentence to write to the file. So maybe something like hello world. And then the idea is that it will actually write that content out to the file. So very simple. All the program does right now is just prompts me to essentially read in that information. And then I have an if statement down here. If they said to write, then we're going to open the file, write to the file, and close it. If they said to read, right, then we're going to open the file, read the file in, and then close that file. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is actually write a little bit of code to try to read in from a file. So we'll keep it very, very simple here and primitive. So the first class that I like to use, there's a number of ways that you can do file input and output, but the way that I typically do it is using the file input stream. So I'm going to create a new file input stream. I always just call it FIS for file input stream, equals new file input stream. And then we're going to pass into it the file name. Okay, so if you go and look up here, file name was something that we read in from that user. Okay, so once we have that file name opened in the file input stream, we're going to go ahead and create a scanner. And I'm going to call this fscan for file scan. That's equal to new scanner FIS. So basically that scanner that we're used to reading in from the console, we're just going to wrap it around that input stream as well. Now that file input stream, I do need to, at least in Eclipse, hover over and import from java.io. Okay, but you'll see another error comes up, and that is, it basically says, hey, you have an unhandled exception type, and it actually shows me right here, file not found exception is unhandled. Okay, so the file not found exception is what is called a checked exception, which means you literally cannot compile your Java code if you do not surround this code right here that could generate that file not found exception with a try catch block. Okay, so we literally can't compile unless we go ahead and add a try up here. And I'm just going to surround this whole little chunk with the try and then a catch. And I'm going to start off by just catching exception E. This is how I always start off anything that I'm going to have exceptions. I just have it catch exception E. I let any exceptions get generated, and then I go ahead and write the specific exceptions. So for starters, I'm going to literally just do e.print stack trace. So nothing special here. The idea is that this code shouldn't get generated very often. If it is getting generated, it should really be in the code writing and debugging process, not necessarily in the production process. So I'm just going to keep it kind of real messy by just printing out that stack trace. Okay, so we've now, go ahead and fix my indentation here. We now have opened this file, and I want to go ahead and read it in. Okay, so I'm going to do that very simply by saying while fscan dot has next line. Okay, so while there was another line in that file, I'm going to go ahead and just print it out. And I'll go ahead and maybe put a tab in there, and then I'll print out fscan dot next line. Okay, and then finally, anytime I open a file, whether to read from it or to write to it, you always want to close that file. And if you're using two classes like this, the file input stream and the scanner, you always want to close them in the reverse order of what you open them in. So I want to do my fscan.close and then the fis.close as well. Okay, and I might typically do this down in a finally, but since we're not really practicing in learning file input output here, what we're really focusing on is this exception. I'm going to kind of keep the code a little bit cleaner for you and do these simple operations all in the try right here. It will work just the same for this example. Okay, so we have this file that we're opening, whatever file name they gave us, and then we're going to read in each line of that file and just print it out to the screen, and then we're going to go ahead and close that file. Okay, so let's go ahead and give this a try. And what we will see, please enter the name of the file you wish to read write. So maybe I do something like input.txt. Would you like to read from or write to the file? So obviously we want to read because that's the only if-else statement that we've actually implemented right here. And we see that file not found exception for the first time. Okay, so it's really nice. If you just do the print stack trace, it'll give you everything. It'll tell you that file not found exception, input.txt, the system cannot find the file specified. Okay, and then it'll tell you, if you look down here, the exact line 46, this line right here. So anytime you see a file not found exception, almost always you're just passing in the wrong name. Maybe you misspelled a file that really was there. We'll go through a few cases, but this is the number one cases that the file is just not there, you misspelled it. Okay, so let's go ahead and create that file. So I'm going to go over here to my project, and I'm going to right click, new, and just go down to file, and I'm just going to now call this input.txt, and I'll just go ahead and hit finish. So you can see that input.txt is right there by my source directory. It's just in the top level directory. Okay, so here you can see maybe I can put, you know, line 1, line 2, line 3. Okay, so now that's in there. Now I can go ahead and play this, and I will do input.txt again, and this time read, and now you'll see line 1, line 2, line 3. Okay, now if I wanted to clean this up a little bit, I think it's a little bit messy to keep that exception E out here. You typically want to actually catch that file not found exception. If you know that a specific type of exception is going to occur with some decent amount of frequency, or really at all, you want to try to catch that specifically. Because I really don't want to give that's not necessarily it can be very common for someone to just mistype, right? Oh, maybe I do input and I forget the txt. And now I see, hey, they can't find that file. This is really messy, right? So what we should really do is add another catch in here. Catch file not found exception. Just call it E. And here, I just want to have a very simple but clean message. So what I'm going to say is system.out.print. I'll do a printf. And I'll say something like this: error a %s, so this will be the class name, the file exception name. I guess I actually don't need to do that. I'll do this programmatically just to kind of show you how you can do this, but you could hard code a file not found exception as well. But a %s occurred, %s, and then we'll get a specific message. So here I'm just going to pass in e.getClass .toString for this first parameter, and that's going to basically print out file not found exception. And this, for the second parameter, I'm going to pass e.getMessage. Okay, and from there we can go ahead and play this, and now you'll see when they type in input, would you like to read from or write from a file? I'll do read. You can see error class file not found exception occurred, input, the system cannot find the file specified. So it tells you very clearly what the problem is right there. Okay. Now if we wanted, we could format that just a little bit more nicely so it's not going off the screen for us. So maybe what I'll do is I'll do a new line right there and a tab. And I'll add a new line at the very end. So now input read. So there we have an error, right? It gives you the actual file not found exception, and then this is your specific problem. The system cannot find the file specified. So this is really useful. File not found exception is one of the better exceptions to me, in that this get message is almost always useful. It'll usually tell you something really useful, where there are a lot of exceptions out there where you get the message and it will give you nothing. So it doesn't really help you at all. Okay, so we tried reading from a file that doesn't exist. Now let's try reading from a folder instead of a file. So obviously I can't open up a folder and start reading text in it, right? It just doesn't really make sense. So let's imagine that I had a program where I had a folder called input, and then I had put, really I want all my text files in there. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a new folder, and I'll call this something like input. Okay, so now if we go ahead and try to read that folder, right, we say input read, you'll see access is denied. Okay, access is denied. So this is the particular error message that you get when you're using the file input stream and trying to open up a folder to read from it. It just kind of gives you this generic access is denied method or message. Another problem you might run into is if you had input.txt in that folder, right? So now we have a little bit of hierarchy. And maybe when you run this now, you say, all right, well, let me open up input.txt. Right? That's a very common thing. You know you have an input.txt file, you spell it right, but what you don't realize is it's not in that top level directory anymore. Okay, it says cannot find that file. Instead, what I would need to do is input/input.txt and then read from that, and then it will go ahead and find that. Okay, so those are typically the things to look out for when you're reading from a file. Now let's talk about writing to a file. Okay, so I'm going to go up to my isWrite method, and I'm going to go ahead and start implementing the code for that. Okay, so it's going to be very similar to our reading operation. Instead of a file input stream, I'm going to have a file output stream. I'll call this FOS, and that's equal to new file output stream, and I'm just going to pass file name in there. Okay, this time I'm going to use the print writer, and I'm going to wrap that around and say print writer PW equals new print writer FOS. Okay, so I'm going to wrap that print writer around my file output stream, and that's essentially going to let me use the methods that we're already familiar with, print and printf and print line like we have on system.out. I get those same methods. Instead of writing to the console, they're going to write to the file that I passed in. Okay, so I need to go ahead and import a few things. So I'll import the print writer. I'll go ahead and import the file output stream. And then again, you will see, hey, this file output stream has a checked exception that could be generated with file not found exception. So just like we did before, we're gonna surround this entire thing with a try, and then the catch. And I'm gonna go ahead and just use the exact same catches that we had down here, because they're actually the exact same thing we want to do. We're gonna catch that file not found exception, print out the message. Otherwise, we'll just print the stack trace for any other generic exception that we weren't expecting to encounter. Okay, so I'll go ahead and just paste that right there. All right, so now all that's left for us to do, let's go ahead and fix the indentation so it reads a little bit nicer. So now all that's left to do is write to the file and close it. So we'll say pw dot, I'm just going to say print line content to write. Okay, what's content to write? That's just the particular sentence that we read in when we asked them to enter a sentence to write to a file. Okay, so we'll go ahead now and we'll close the file. Again, you close the classes in the opposite order in which you open them. So pw.close and fos.close. Okay, So let's go ahead and give this a try now. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And this time I'm going to create a new file. We'll say input2.txt. Okay, or maybe let's just call it output.txt. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead this time and do a write command, and then I'm going to say hello file world or something like that. Okay, now you would expect that this would generate a file not found exception because this file output.txt does not actually exist. But let's go ahead and run this code, and what we actually see is it appears to have just ran the program, and it didn't generate any output, so that tells us that no exception was generated. And if we go over here and refresh our workspace, we will see that output.txt does work. It does exist, and in fact has that hello file world in there. Okay, and I could obviously run this program again, and I can say output.txt. This time we're going to read it, and you'll see a hello file world does exist. Okay, so essentially just wanted to emphasize right here that when I write to a file that doesn't exist, no exception actually is generated. It actually will just create that file. Okay, so now that I have that file out there, what I want to do is try to overwrite that file. Okay, so I can do that pretty easily if I just go ahead and run this again. I'll say output.txt, and I'll say write to that file, and this time I will say changed or something like that, right? If I open up that output.txt, you'll see that in fact it was changed. Okay, so let's now imagine that you have another program on this computer which is actually editing this file. Okay, so if I go and I'll maybe right click and I'll say open with default editor. Okay, and maybe that will open up, it just opens up here. Let me go ahead and actually right click, I'll say show in System Explorer. Okay, that's going to bring up in Windows my File Explorer. So here's my output.txt. I can open it up. I'm just going to open it up, right click, and say open with Notepad. Okay, so it basically opened it up with a Notepad, changed. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead, let me kind of move this out of the way. I'm going to try to change this one more time. Okay, so now I'm going to say output.txt. I'm going to write, and I'm going to say changed to. Okay, and what you see is no exception was generated. And when I actually open this file again, you'll see it doesn't change it right here, but if I close it and then reopen it, if I open with that Notepad, you'll see change to. Okay, so what I want to emphasize here is not every other program that is operating with this file. So you can say I had Notepad which was operating with change to. It didn't necessarily put a hold on that file so that no one else could change it. However, if I right click on this file output.txt and this time I say open with and try something like Microsoft Word, what we'll see is that Microsoft Word will actually put a hold on this file so that no one else can actually write to that file. Okay, so this time I'll go ahead and just kind of keep it right there off the screen, and I'm going to go ahead and output.txt, I'm going to go ahead and write to it changed 3. Okay, this time when we run it, you'll see file not found exception, output.txt. The process cannot access the file because it is being used by another process. Okay, so again, it's really important that you're printing out that message because it almost always with the file not found exception gives you really useful information. So now you're thinking, oh, that's right, I was editing this file using Microsoft Word. So you can go ahead and just close that. And then of course, when I try to do this again now, I say output.txt, write, changed 4. You'll see that I have no problem changing that file to changed 4. Okay, so that's a big one, right? When you're trying to write to a file that is opened by another process. Okay, another thing to look at is what if that file actually has some kind of read-only hold on it. So if I am in my File Explorer, you saw that we just wrote out changed for. If I come and I right-click on this output.txt, go to Properties, and then I click on Read-Only. I hit OK. Okay, so now you have some kind of read lock or a write lock, so you cannot write. So let's go ahead and try this one more time. I try to do output.txt. I'm going to write to it, and I'm just going to write a bunch of 5s to it. Okay, and again, you see very clearly the file name output.txt, access is denied. Okay, obviously if we go ahead and go back to our properties, change that to so it can read it, and we run this again, write a bunch of 6s, we will see that in fact we are able to write the new material out there. Okay. Okay, so the last scenario that I want to show is what if we try to write to a folder. Okay, so if we see in this case over here we have our input folder and our input.txt. So it's a very common mistake. You may go ahead and say, all right, well, let me write to input. Okay, or let's actually do something even a little bit more easy to mess up. If my input.txt is right here, let me move it, right here next to this input folder, right? Maybe my output was in that input, who knows, right? So you're looking, you say, oh, I have this file, input.txt. It's right there. Okay, so you go ahead and you just type in, okay, input, and essentially what you do is you forget the extension, the .txt, and you go ahead and you try to write, and then you say, all right, some content. And then what you see here is that access is denied. Okay, so that's the one message that's a little bit generic, is the access is denied if it's a folder, right? You just don't have access to write to the contents of a folder like this. It doesn't really make sense. So just be careful if you see that access is denied, and using that FileNotFoundException, and even more specifically perhaps the file input streams and file output streams. That's kind of a clue to make sure that you're not somehow trying to read from or write to a file when you, or I'm sorry, a folder when you mean to read from or write to a file. So obviously if I go ahead and I try this one more time, input.txt, and then I try to write to it, we shouldn't have any problem in that case because you gave it the full file extension. You didn't get it confused with this file name right here. Okay, so in this video tutorial, we essentially talked about the FileNotFoundException. We went through some examples of reading from a file and writing to a file. We saw that a FileNotFoundException can be generated when a file doesn't exist that we're trying to read in, or if the file is in another folder. It does exist, but it's not in the location that we thought it was. We saw the FileNotFoundException is generated when I'm trying to read from a folder instead of a file. We saw that a FileNotFoundException was not generated when we tried to write to a file that doesn't exist. It just simply creates that file and writes out to it. And then a FileNotFoundException is generated when I'm trying to write to a file that's already opened by another editor, such as Microsoft Word or something like that, when the file is in a read-only state, or when the file that we're trying to write is actually a folder name instead. If we maybe, and that will typically happen if you forget the file extension. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. We got some really cool stuff coming up.